So what actually ties us together? Well, we've got a common heritage for a start. We have this bloke called Abel Tasman. By the way, with a name like Van Manenberg, which is my surname, that's where I come from too, originally. I was 2 years old when we moved to Australia. So yeah, I have a Dutch heritage as well. But I'm dinky-die Aussie today. But yeah, way back in 1642, he sailed around the southern part of Australia and found what he called Van Diemen's Land. And you can see down here, Tasmania. So they've changed it to honour him, of course, from Van Diemen's Land to Tasmania. So he sailed around the bottom parts of that, charted it, and then continued on his eastward journey to discover New Zealand. So he sailed on the west coast, halfway up the coast of New Zealand, right up to the North Island, and then he went around the top basically of Australia, past New Guinea, back to the Dutch East Indies, the VOC. I'll try and say it in Dutch, Vereniging Oost-Indische Company, so the VOC, Dutch East India Company in English, that's much easier. So he went to Batavia as part of the Spice Island, looking at things there. He then did a second journey and charted the top part of Australia. So we've got that common kinship to start with Abel Tasman, and then we come to deal with Captain Cook, who did his sail, came from Tahiti to watch the transition of Venus, and then came to the North Island of New Zealand, and then sailed around up the west coast as well, over to Australia, and then charted the east coast of Australia all the way up to Cooktown, where his ship had a bit of a problem when it ran aground on a reef. He had to take it ashore, basically, sailed it onto the mud flats at Cooktown, turned her on its side so he could do the repairs, and then he continued on with his journey. So, common ancestry with Cook and Tasman as part of the discovery. So, from there, what's the other things that we've got similarities about? Well, we're both known as Down Under. And here you can see Australia, nice and yellow and dry, and green, and New Zealand, nice and green and lush. So a bit of a contrast between the two countries. North Island is perhaps a little bit more like Australia than the South Island, because the South Island, as we experienced yesterday, the ruggedness of everything and the sounds, even though it was wet. Did you have a good time with that lot? Pretty spectacular, isn't it? I think sailing beside a mountain, quite unreal. So both isolated, both known as Down Under, and we have what we call the ditch, a 2,000 kilometre wide ditch that separates us. What else is same as about us is we were both colonies, and New Zealand was administered from Sydney for many, many years. New Zealand and Australia shared the resources of the Royal Navy, the Marines, the soldiers, the settlers, that sort of thing, the government side of things for many years. So being administered from Sydney, yeah, we went backwards and forwards over the ditch over the years. The other thing too that happened was when Australia and New Zealand were thinking about going their own ways, becoming independent colonies, Australia had an Act of Parliament that was proposed. A lot of people think that New Zealand is mentioned in the Australian Constitution. It isn't. It's mentioned in a proposal, and you can see here the Constitution Act. This was a proposal that Australia and New Zealand could become independent from England and, you know, run their own race, so to speak, have their own government, etc. And in that Act of Parliament that they talk about that enabled that to actually happen, they highlight the states shall mean such as the colonies of New South Wales, New Zealand, Queensland, Tasmania, etc. Now, New Zealand chose not to participate. They were their own nation, and why would you want to become part of Australia in those circumstances? They were, developing their own resources, rather unique with their country. Their country was vastly or significantly different to Australia. They had different aspects to the way they ran their life compared to what Australia did. They didn't have as many convicts as well, so other things that sort of may have swayed their opinion about going independent. So it's mentioned in that Constitution Act, but it's not actually part of our Constitution, so interesting there. We also gave them our possums and we gave them our wallabies. And you talk to Kiwis about that, I don't think they're too happy about that. Probably yesterday when we were going through the sounds, you may have heard the gentleman speak about the introduced species. And possums have been a great problem for New Zealand. And likewise with the wallaby, they're trying to get rid of them because they really wreck the place. It's taking away from their normal natural surroundings. So it's somewhat of a problem that they're trying to overcome. And in Australia we have the same thing where the English introduced rabbits and dogs and cats, so there's a lot of feral animals in Australia that are doing great destruction to the natural fauna and flora there too. So destructive stuff that we really don't want to go on. So a couple of issues there that sort of, tie us together a little bit about the colonisation, administered from Sydney, sharing those resources and having the settlers come backwards and forwards between the both countries, depending on when gold was discovered, of course. We'll talk about that tomorrow when we look at marvellous Melbourne. The other thing that starts to really tie us together is the Boer War.